Eli had never been one to get attached easily. In fact, he'd spent most of his life keeping people at arm's length, wary of the inevitable disappointment that came with closeness. But with Luca, something was different. The rules of their arrangement had been clear from the start. No love, no strings, just physicality. Yet, despite Luca's constant reminders to keep things casual, Eli couldn't help but feel something more, something he hadn't anticipated when he first agreed to the proposition. It started with small moments, seemingly insignificant, but slowly weaving a thread of connection between them. One rainy afternoon, Luca showed up at Eli's dorm with 2 cups of coffee. He didn't knock. He just walked in, as if this was a routine. "Figured you'd be holed up in here," Luca said, holding out a cup. "You've been MIA for a few days." Eli blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected gesture. He took the coffee, his fingers brushing against Luca's in the process, and for a moment the world outside the window seemed to disappear. "Thanks," Eli muttered, his voice soft, unsure of how to respond. Luca shrugged and sat on the edge of the bed. "No problem. Just don't tell anyone I'm capable of being nice. It'll ruin my image." Eli chuckled at that, the sound escaping before he could stop it. Luca's humor, dry and often teasing, was one of the things that made him so hard to resist. There was a certain charm in the way he could disarm Eli with just a few words. And in that moment, as they sat in comfortable silence, sipping their coffee, Eli felt the first stirring of something deeper. It wasn't just about the physical connection anymore. There was a spark of something else, something that made Eli's heart beat faster than usual. Later that week, Eli found himself sitting at his desk, sketching, as he often did when his thoughts became too overwhelming. His hand moved across the paper with a mind of its own, lines and shapes forming without any conscious effort. When he glanced down at the page, his breath caught in his throat. It was a portrait of Luca. He'd never intended to draw him. In fact, he hadn't even thought about Luca in this way before, at least not consciously. But there, in the rough sketch before him, was the curve of Luca's jawline, the way his eyes always seemed to glimmer with mischief, and the subtle smirk that could both tease and invite. Eli's pulse quickened as he stared at the image in front of him, suddenly overwhelmed by the realization that Luca had taken up more space in his heart than he cared to admit. But that wasn't all. As he traced the outline of Luca's face with his pencil, Eli's thoughts drifted to the moments they'd shared, the quiet mornings when Luca would bring coffee, their late-night conversations, the way Luca's smile would soften when he thought no one was looking. These moments had become etched in Eli's mind, filling him with warmth even when they weren't together. He couldn't deny it anymore. He was falling for Luca, but that thought brought with it a rush of panic. He hadn't signed up for this. Their arrangement was meant to be simple, no emotional involvement, no expectations. But here he was, staring at a portrait of the man who had made him feel more alive than he ever had before. Eli paused, staring at the unfinished drawing, his heart caught between desire and fear. He knew this wasn't what Luca wanted, but how could he ignore what his own heart was telling him? He wanted more. He wanted to feel loved, to be seen for more than just his quiet nature. But how could he ask for that from Luca, who had made it clear from the beginning that he was incapable of offering anything beyond casual fun? The next time they met, Eli tried to push his growing feelings aside. He couldn't let himself get caught up in something that wasn't real. He met Luca at a cafe on campus, hoping that the public setting would provide enough distance to keep things light. But as they sat across from each other, sipping their drinks, Eli couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed between them. Luca was unusually quiet, his usual teasing smile replaced with a thoughtful expression as he stared out the window. Eli watched him for a moment, his eyes tracing the way Luca's fingers wrapped around the cup, the subtle tension in his posture. For a second, it seemed as if Luca was lost in his own world, unaware of Eli's presence. But then, as if sensing Eli's gaze, Luca looked up and met his eyes. "You've been quiet today," Luca remarked, his voice low. "What's going on in that head of yours?" Eli hesitated. Should he tell him? Should he admit that every time Luca smiled at him, his heart skipped a beat? That every time Luca's hand brushed against his, he wanted to pull him closer, to make the touch last longer? No, he couldn't say that. Not when Luca had made it so clear that emotions were off limits. "Nothing," Eli said, forcing a smile. "Just tired, I guess." Luca raised an eyebrow, his lips curling into a smirk. "Uh-huh. Sure, if that's what you want to tell me." Eli's heart fluttered at the teasing tone, but he quickly looked away, trying to focus on the cup in front of him. Days passed, and Eli found himself sinking deeper into the confusion of his emotions. He tried to convince himself that it was just a fleeting attraction, nothing more than physical chemistry. But it wasn't. He couldn't ignore the way his heart seemed to ache when Luca wasn't around, the way his thoughts drifted to the moments they'd shared, the way he found himself sketching Luca again and again. But Luca kept his distance, emotionally. Every time Eli tried to push past the surface, to ask about Luca's past or get a glimpse into his deeper thoughts, Luca would deflect with humor or change the subject. He kept the boundaries firm, always reminding Eli that this was supposed to be about physical connection and nothing else. One evening, after a particularly intense moment between them, Eli lay in bed, his heart heavy with the weight of his feelings. Luca had left as soon as they were done, as he always did, without a word or a look back. Eli couldn't help the frustration that bubbled up inside him. Why couldn't Luca see what was happening? Why couldn't he understand that Eli was beginning to want more? He wanted to matter to Luca in a way that went beyond their arrangement, beyond the fleeting touches and whispered promises. He wanted to be seen. But Luca was a wall, unyielding and unbreakable, and Eli was just one more person trying to scale it. Eli's fingers traced the edge of his sketchbook, the drawing of Luca still staring back at him. The smile Luca had flashed him that night was captured in the pencil lines, but the sadness in his eyes was clear as well. He couldn't keep doing this. He couldn't keep falling for someone who wasn't capable of feeling the same way. But the truth gnawed at him. He didn't know how to stop. The night was quiet, save for the soft hum of traffic outside and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Eli sat on the edge of his bed, his hands trembling as they gripped the edge of his phone. He had been pacing for hours, his mind racing with 1,000 different thoughts, each one more confusing and painful than the last. The message was simple, the words already written in his head 100 times over, but still it felt impossible to send. "Tell him, Eli." He repeated the words in his mind like a mantra, trying to quiet the storm of emotions that had been brewing inside him for weeks. He glanced at the clock. It was late, well past midnight. Luca hadn't texted him since their last encounter, and he hadn't seen him on campus for a few days. It was as if Luca had retreated completely, leaving Eli to navigate the emotions that had been consuming him. He couldn't stop thinking about Luca, couldn't stop wishing that their arrangement had turned into something more. But most of all, he couldn't stop longing for a love that Luca had made it clear he couldn't offer. No more running, Eli thought, closing his eyes for a moment. It was time. He had to confront his feelings, even if it meant risking everything. With a deep breath, he typed out the message. "Luca, I can't do this anymore. I know you've made it clear that you don't want anything serious, but I can't keep pretending I don't want more. I've fallen for you. I care about you more than I ever thought I would. I need to know if you feel the same. If not, I think it's better if we stop this." Eli hesitated for a moment, his thumb hovering over the send button. A part of him screamed to hold back, to bury these feelings deeper where they couldn't hurt him. But the other part, the part that had allowed himself to be vulnerable with Luca in ways he had never done before, needed this. Needed to know if there was even a sliver of hope that Luca might feel the same. He hit send. The seconds that followed felt like hours. His heart pounded in his chest, and his breath caught in his throat. He stared at the screen, waiting for Luca's reply, praying that it wouldn't be another one of those casual, indifferent responses that always seemed to deflect the deeper emotions Eli so desperately wanted to share. Then his phone buzzed. It was Luca. Eli's stomach churned as he opened the message, the words hitting him like a punch to the gut. Eli, listen, I don't want you to get the wrong idea. What we have is what it is. I've been clear about that from the start. Love isn't something I can offer. It's not realistic. I don't need it, and I don't think you do either. If this is about needing more from me, then maybe it's better we stop. Eli's vision blurred as he read and reread Luca's words, disbelief mixing with a deep sense of pain. The message was short, cold, almost mechanical, and every word cut through him like a blade. Love isn't something I can offer. It's not realistic. Eli felt as though the ground had shifted beneath him, and he was falling, plunging into a darkness he hadn't expected to encounter. The weight of Luca's rejection crushed him. His heart, which had been so full of hope just moments ago, was now hollow, left with nothing but the remnants of a dream he had clung to. How had he misjudged everything? How had he allowed himself to believe that Luca might have felt even a fraction of what he felt? His fingers trembled as he set the phone down on the bed beside him. The silence in the room was suffocating, each breath he took feeling heavier than the last. He wanted to scream, to shout at the universe for being so cruel. He had trusted Luca, allowed himself to believe in the possibility of something real, only to be told that it was all for nothing, that Luca had never felt the same way, that he had been nothing more than a passing whim for someone who couldn't be bothered with the complexities of love. Tears welled up in Eli's eyes, blurring his vision as they began to spill over, streaking down his cheeks. His body trembled as the weight of the rejection settled deep in his chest. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. All he could feel was the ache of a love that would never be returned. The tears came in waves, quiet sobs at first, and then gasps for air as the realization set in. He had given so much of himself to Luca, poured his heart into something that had been doomed from the start. He had tried to keep his emotions in check, to follow the rules of their arrangement, but in the end, he couldn't help it. He had fallen for Luca, and now he had to face the truth. Luca didn't feel the same. He had made a mistake. He should never have let himself get this deep. He had known the rules, had agreed to them with his eyes wide open, and yet, somewhere along the way, his heart had betrayed him. Now, he was left with nothing but the bitter sting of regret. After what felt like hours of lying in bed, tears soaking the pillow beneath him, Eli finally sat up, wiping his face with the sleeve of his shirt. His head throbbed from the emotional weight, but there was a clarity that began to form in the haze. He couldn't keep doing this. He couldn't keep chasing after something that wasn't meant to be. His phone buzzed again. This time it was a follow-up message from Luca. I don't want things to get weird between us, Eli. If you need space, I understand. Eli's chest tightened as he read the message. The finality of it hit him harder than the first. Luca wasn't sorry. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was simply offering the same indifference that had been there from the beginning. Eli's eyes stung as he stared at the screen, but this time the tears didn't come. Instead, something inside him shifted. It was painful, but it was also liberating. He couldn't keep holding on to someone who didn't want him. He couldn't keep sacrificing his own happiness for the sake of a man who couldn't see him for who he truly was. With a deep breath, Eli typed a response. I think it's best if we end things. I need to move on. Goodbye, Luca. He hit send before he could second-guess himself, before the familiar longing could rise up again and convince him to hold on just a little longer. Eli set the phone down, his hands shaking, his heart heavy but strangely resolute. He had made the right decision. It hurt, more than he could have imagined, but it was the only choice left. He deserved more than a fleeting connection. He deserved someone who could give him the love and respect he longed for, and Luca wasn't that person. For the first time in what felt like forever, Eli made the choice to put himself first. The next few days passed in a blur. Eli went through the motions of his daily life, attending classes, drawing in his sketchbook, and pretending everything was fine. But inside, a storm raged. It wasn't just the heartbreak. It was the quiet devastation of letting go of a dream that had felt so real, only to realize it had never been within reach. But slowly, the hurt began to dull. The tears stopped, and a quiet strength began to take its place. Eli spent more time drawing, channeling his emotions into his art, finding solace in the strokes of his pencil as they filled the pages with expressions of his pain and growth. He had been broken, but he wasn't defeated. One evening, as he sat in the corner of the campus library, sketching quietly, he realized something. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he was choosing himself. He wasn't chasing after something that would never be his. He wasn't begging for love from someone who couldn't give it. Eli was learning how to love himself, and that for now was enough. The hum of Eli's pencil against the sketchbook was the only sound in his small, dimly lit apartment. It had become his sanctuary, a place where he could retreat from the world, where no one could judge him, where he didn't have to pretend that everything was okay. The past few weeks had been nothing short of painful, but in that solitude, he had begun to heal. Slowly, painfully, but surely. Eli's art had always been a way for him to express what words could not. When he was younger, it had been his escape from the world around him. The strokes of his pencil, the swirls of ink on the page, had always offered comfort, a way to pour out the confusion and turmoil inside him. And now, more than ever, his art had become his refuge. He sat hunched over his desk, eyes focused on the blank page in front of him. The assignment for his upcoming gallery exhibition loomed over him, a reminder that life had to go on despite the heartache he felt. It had been weeks since the breakup with Luca, and while the pain hadn't completely faded, Eli had discovered something important during that time. He was still capable of creating, of moving forward. The pieces he was working on now were raw, emotional. The brokenness he had felt, had lived, was pouring out through his art. His sketches were no longer just abstract lines or distant representations of the human form. They were his emotions, his heartache, his fear, and his hope all captured in the strokes of his pencil. Each piece was a journey through his pain, and yet, with every line, he could feel himself taking a step closer to acceptance. As Eli added shading to the latest sketch, the doorbell rang, startling him. He hadn't been expecting anyone. He wiped his hands on his jeans and walked toward the door, his heart still heavy from his thoughts. When he opened it, a familiar face greeted him with a warm smile. "Hey, Eli," Noahan said, stepping into the doorway. "Long time no see." Noah, Eli's childhood friend, the one person who had always been there, even when Eli had pushed him away. He had disappeared years ago when his family moved abroad, but now he was back, standing in front of Eli as if no time had passed at all. Eli's heart skipped a beat at the sight of him. Noah had changed. Of course. He was taller now, his face a little more defined, his hair slightly longer and tousled in a way that made him look effortlessly cool. But his eyes were still the same. Soft, kind, and there was something else in those eyes, something Eli hadn't quite been able to put his finger on until now. Noah smiled as he took in the scene of Eli's apartment. "Looks like you've been busy," he remarked, glancing at the sketches scattered across the desk. Eli nodded, a small, appreciative smile forming on his lips. "Yeah, I've been working on some pieces for the exhibition," he replied, stepping aside to let Noah in. "I'm not sure if they're any good, but it helps." Noah closed the door behind him and took a seat at the small dining table, watching Eli carefully. "That's the thing with art, right? It doesn't have to be good. It just has to be real. And I can tell these are... Eli's heart clenched at the sincerity in Noah's voice. He was always like this, caring, understanding, never judgmental. Eli felt a warmth spread through him, a comfort he hadn't realized he'd been missing until this moment. "Thanks," Eli muttered, not trusting his voice to say more. The rawness of the past few weeks still hung in the air, a weight Eli wasn't sure how to explain. But for the first time in a while, being near Noah didn't feel like a distraction from his pain. It felt like something more, something safe. "So," Noah said, leaning forward slightly, "I heard you and Luca, well, I heard things didn't work out." Eli's stomach tightened at the mention of Luca's name, but he forced himself to keep his voice steady. "Yeah, it didn't." Noah's gaze softened. "I'm sorry. I know you two were close. I hate that you're going through this alone." Eli smiled bitterly. "It's not that bad. I'll be fine." But Noah didn't buy it. He stood up and walked over to Eli, placing a hand on his shoulder with the same quiet, comforting gesture he'd offered when they were younger. It was the kind of touch that spoke louder than words, a reminder that Eli wasn't as alone as he often felt. "You don't have to pretend with me, Eli," Noah said gently. "I'm here for you, okay?" Eli nodded, his throat tight. The dam that had held back his emotions for so long began to crack, but he couldn't bring himself to let the floodgates open. Not yet, not when he wasn't sure if he was ready to confront everything that had been simmering beneath the surface. But Noah didn't push. He just stood there, his presence grounding Eli in a way that felt both comforting and foreign. "So, how have you been?" Eli asked, trying to change the subject and redirect his own emotions. "What have you been up to all these years?" Noah chuckled, sitting back down at the table. "Same old. I was studying abroad in Paris. You know, living the cliché dream of eating croissants and sketching in cafes." Eli couldn't help but laugh, the tension in his chest easing just a little. "Sounds like a movie." "It kind of was," Noah replied with a grin. "But now that I'm back, I'm just trying to figure out what to do next. And, well, catching up with you seems like a good place to start." Eli's heart swelled at the kindness in Noah's voice. The connection between them had always been easy, like breathing. But now, there was something different about it, something deeper, more meaningful. Maybe it was the way Noah was looking at him, as if Eli mattered in a way he hadn't fully realized before. Maybe it was the way Noah made him feel safe, like everything would be okay. They spent the next hour talking about everything and nothing. Noah talked about his adventures in Paris, about the people he'd met, and the lessons he'd learned. Eli listened, fascinated by how much Noah had grown, but also feeling the stirrings of something else deep within him. Something he hadn't felt in a long time. Something that felt like hope. And then, just as the conversation began to wind down, Noah stood up, offering Eli a hand. "How about we grab some coffee? I think you need a break from all these sketches." Eli smiled, surprised by the offer, but grateful for it. "Yeah, sure, coffee sounds good." As they walked out of the apartment together, Eli felt something shift inside him. It wasn't a grand revelation or a sudden wave of clarity. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The weight of his heartbreak wasn't gone, but for the first time in weeks, Eli felt like he could breathe again. Noah's presence was like a balm to his wounded heart. He wasn't Luca. He wasn't the person Eli had allowed himself to fall in love with, despite all the warnings. But Noah was something just as important. He was a reminder that there was more to life than the hurt he had been clinging to. That there were people who cared for him, who saw him for who he was, and who didn't need him to be anything other than himself. As they stepped into the cool evening air, Eli realized that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late for him to open his heart again, to someone who wouldn't break it, to someone who could offer him what Luca never would, a real connection, free of fear and doubt. For the first time in what felt like forever, Eli allowed himself to believe in the possibility of something new. As they made their way to the coffee shop, Eli smiled to himself, feeling the weight of the past lift just a little. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, he wasn't afraid to find out. Luca paced around his apartment, his fingers running through his messy hair, as his mind replayed the same scenes over and over again, scenes that had haunted him for weeks. Eli's absence, the quiet emptiness that lingered in the corners of his life. It wasn't something he had been prepared for. In the beginning, Luca had convinced himself that it would be fine, that he could move on, as he always did, with the countless other people he had come and gone through his life. But this was different. The apartment was cold, sterile, as if every trace of Eli had been wiped away. The last time they had been here together, Luca had been confident. He had set the rules, no strings, no emotions. It had been easy to convince himself that it was all just a game, that he wasn't really feeling anything. After all, he had never been one for commitment, never been one to get attached. But now, as he stood alone in the space they had once shared, the walls seemed to close in on him. He couldn't deny it anymore. He had been lying to himself. He grabbed his phone from the counter, scrolling through his messages, but there was nothing from Eli. Not that Luca had expected one. After everything, he couldn't blame him. But still, there was that empty space in his chest, a quiet ache that made it hard to breathe. Luca was used to being in control of his emotions, used to keeping people at arm's length, but Eli had slipped through the cracks, and now it felt as if Luca's world had lost its color. With a frustrated sigh, Luca collapsed onto the couch and opened the podcast app on his phone. Without thinking, his finger hovered over the old recordings of Midnight Confessions. He had always kept Raven and Luca apart, as if they were two different persons. Raven was a personality he created as an escape from his world, and Luca his one self, until Eli showed up and everything changed. He had been the reason he connected Luca and Raven together, which made him feel a whole again, and now he was gone. Luca closed his eyes, resting his head against the couch. What have I done? The silence in the apartment was deafening, and Luca could no longer ignore the ache in his chest. The games he had played, the rules he had set for their arrangement, they had all seemed fine at the time, a way to keep things casual. But now, with Eli gone, it all felt hollow. He had pushed Eli away, convinced himself that the distance was what they both needed, and in doing so, he had destroyed the one thing he hadn't even realized he had wanted. His hand wandered to his phone again, but before he could open the podcast app, his screen lit up with a notification. It was a photo from one of his social media feeds. He opened it without thinking, and his stomach dropped when he saw the picture. Eli and Noah, smiling, laughing. The image was casual, nothing overtly intimate, but the closeness between them was undeniable. Noah had his arm draped casually around Eli's shoulder, and Eli, for the first time in a long while, was smiling freely, genuinely, happily. The kind of smile Luca hadn't seen in ages, the one he had once thought was reserved for him. A surge of jealousy flared in Luca's chest, and for a moment he couldn't breathe. He gripped his phone tightly, his knuckles turning white. How dare he? His mind screamed. How dare Eli move on so easily, as if everything we shared meant nothing? Luca threw his phone down on the coffee table, his heart racing, a knot of anger and confusion tightening in his gut. He could feel the sting of rejection all over again, the frustration that Eli had found someone else so soon. It shouldn't have mattered. Eli had made his choice when he had ended things, and Luca had respected it in his own way. But seeing Eli so happy with Noah, it was too much. It was a punch to the gut, one that Luca wasn't prepared for. As much as he hated to admit it, he was furious. Not just because Eli had moved on, but because Luca had never allowed himself to truly admit how much Eli had meant to him, how much he still meant to him. The realization hit him with full force, and it made him sick to his stomach. He had to do something. He couldn't just sit by and let Eli slip away into someone else's arms. He wasn't the type of person to sit back and watch someone else claim what was his. Luca stood up abruptly, the anger boiling over inside him. He needed to see Eli. He needed to make things right, or at least try. This wasn't about pride anymore. It wasn't just about his ego or the need to win. It was about something deeper, something raw and real, and Luca wasn't sure he was ready to admit it yet, but the urgency inside him wouldn't let him ignore it any longer. Without thinking, he grabbed his jacket, his keys, and rushed out the door. The night air hit him like a slap to the face as he made his way to Eli's apartment. His footsteps echoed down the quiet streets, the sound of his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. It didn't matter that he had told Eli to move on. It didn't matter that he had set the rules. No love, no expectations. The truth was, Luca had wanted more all along, but he had been too afraid to face it. Now, as he walked toward the apartment, he could no longer deny the truth. He wanted Eli back. He needed him back. As Luca stood outside Eli's building, he hesitated for a moment. His hand was raised to knock, but something inside him paused. What if Eli didn't want him back? What if he had already let go, already moved on completely? The idea of facing Eli's rejection again was almost too much to bear. But then Luca thought of that photo again, the way Noah had his arm around Eli, the way Eli had smiled so naturally, and the anger surged once more. He knocked sharply on the door, unable to stop himself. A moment passed, and then the door opened. Eli stood in front of him, his eyes wide with surprise. His face was a little paler than usual, and there was something guarded in his expression, as if he had already been bracing for this moment. "What are you doing here?" Eli asked, his voice soft, but there was an edge of wariness to it. Luca didn't know how to begin, didn't know what words would make sense. His mouth felt dry, his chest tight with uncertainty, but he couldn't back down now. I need to talk to you," Luca said, his voice rougher than he had intended. Eli's gaze flickered briefly to his phone, which was still lying on the coffee table, and Luca saw the slight tightening of his jaw. He didn't need to ask what Eli was thinking. The evidence was clear. "I don't think there's anything left to talk about, Luca," Eli replied, his voice quiet but firm. Luca felt his heart drop. He had known this wouldn't be easy, but the sting of Eli's words was sharper than he had anticipated. "Eli, please, just hear me out," Luca said, his voice barely above a whisper. Eli hesitated, his gaze flickering between Luca and the door, as if he was deciding whether or not to let him in. After a long moment, he stepped aside, allowing Luca into the apartment. Luca closed the door behind him, his breath catching in his chest. This was it, the moment he had been dreading and yearning for all at once. But it wasn't just about getting Eli back. It was about finally acknowledging the truth, about what he had done, about what he had lost. And this time, Luca wasn't going to let Eli go without a fight.